The morning air in the English countryside was a completely different entity than the smog-choked breezes of Chicago. It was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth, blooming roses, and ancient unyielding stone. I stood on the sprawling limestone balcony of the Windmere estate, my hands resting on the intricately carved balustrade. For as far as my eyes could see, the rolling emerald hills, the manicured hedge mazes, the shimmering blue lake in the distance, it all legally belonged to me. I was no longer the woman who had begged for crumbs of affection in a cramped Lincoln Park kitchen. I was a Lady Aurelia Seraphine Ravencroft of the newly crowned Duchess of Windmir. I looked down at my left hand. My mother's emerald ring caught the morning sunlight, flashing with a brilliant, undeniable fire. It was a flawless 5-carat Colombian emerald, surrounded by a halo of crushed diamonds. Connor had placed it there on the night of my coronation, dropping to one knee after we had escaped the glittering, suffocating reception of 300 aristocratic guests. He had loved me when I was just a barista struggling to pay rent. He had defended me when I was a broken wife covered in spilled champagne, and he loved me now as a sovereign duchess with the weight of centuries on her shoulders. You're up early for someone who now practically runs a small European economy. A gentle, familiar voice interrupted my quiet reflection. I turned to see Connor leaning against the gilded frame of the French doors. He looked entirely out of place in a dark silk dressing gown, yet completely perfectly at home in my heart. This was the man who used to teach high school English to disinterested teenagers, drive a battered 10-year-old Honda Civic with a broken heater, and live in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Now he was the future Duke Consort of a duchy worth approximately £3 billion. I'm just thinking about the absolute whiplash of how fast everything changed, I said, stepping away from the balcony edge and walking into his open arms. He smelled of bergamot, and the expensive tea Mrs. Higgins, the head housekeeper, insisted on brewing every morning. 6 weeks ago I was handed divorce papers over a cup of coffee I spent an hour making. I was told I was boring. I was told I had 24 hours to pack my entire life into boxes and disappear. Now I have an estate of 500 staff members waiting for my instructions. Dalton always was a monumental fool. Connor murmured, pressing a soft kiss to the top of my head. His arms tightened around my waist, a physical anchor, keeping me grounded in my new, terrifying reality. But his profound stupidity was the greatest gift the universe ever handed to me. Have you heard from him? Or the mistress? I shook my head, resting my cheek against his chest. I could hear the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. Thomas handles the international security briefs now. Apparently, Belle left him within 48 hours of discovering the truth. The moment she realized Dalton wasn't a wealthy marketing executive, that he was actually a broke man living off his secret wife's trust fund, she packed her bags and vanished. He was legally evicted from the Lincoln Park house a week later. The royal attorneys didn't even have to try. Since the property was purchased entirely with my trust fund, Dalton had zero legal claim to it. He's back to square one, but this time he has absolutely nothing to fall back on. Connor let out a low, dry chuckle. Karma is a terrifyingly efficient accountant. I thought the chapter on Dalton Kincaid was permanently, irrevocably closed. I believed that returning to England and claiming my birthright had severed the toxic tether between us forever. But I had underestimated the desperate, venomous lengths a narcissist will go to when their fragile ego is entirely shattered. I had forgotten that when a rat is cornered in the dark, it doesn't surrender. It bites. Across the vast dark mirror of the Atlantic Ocean, in a cramped, moldy studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of Chicago, Dalton was staring at his cracked smartphone screen. The apartment smelled of stale beer and unwashed laundry. The radiator hissed violently in the corner, providing little heat against the biting Illinois wind, rattling the thin window panes. He had lost his career at the marketing firm within a week of my departure. Word had spread rapidly through the elite, gossip-hungry circles of Chicago about the man who had arrogantly thrown away the sole heiress to the Duchy of Windmir for a cheap fling. He was a laughingstock, a walking punchline. No reputable firm in the city would touch his resume. Dalton sat on a stained mattress scrolling frantically through British tabloid websites. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by dark, bruised circles of exhaustion and burning envy. He saw high-definition pictures of me wearing the ducal crown draped in velvet and ermine waving to crowds from a gilded carriage. He saw pictures of Connor, his quiet, unassuming loser brother, standing proudly by my side, wearing bespoke suits that cost more than Dalton's old car. The jealousy did not just burn in Dalton's veins, it consumed him completely. He refused to accept that he had been the architect of his own spectacular demise. A narcissist's brain does not possess the capacity for genuine self-reflection. To survive the crushing weight of his own failure, his mind had constructed a new, comfortable delusion. In his twisted reality, I had maliciously deceived him. I had lied about my identity to trap him. And Connor, his own flesh and blood, had betrayed him, stealing his wife and the billions of dollars that Dalton believed were rightfully his. His phone buzzed violently in his hand, startling him. It was an international number beginning with the +44 country code of the United Kingdom. Dalton answered it, his voice rough and suspicious. "Dalton Kincaid? Who is this?" "Mr. Kincaid." A crisp, drippingly aristocratic British voice echoed through the speaker. "My name is Lord Julian Sterling. I am the eldest son of the Viscount of Ashbourne. 5 years ago I was engaged to marry Lady Aurelia, just before she suffered a hysterical breakdown and ran off to America to play at being a peasant." Dalton sat up straight, his heart pounding against his ribs. He remembered the story I told Connor the day the divorce papers were served. The ex-fiancé, the one she caught sleeping with his ex-girlfriend 3 weeks before the royal wedding, a microscopic indiscretion that she blew vastly out of proportion. Julian scoffed, his tone thick with aristocratic entitlement. She dramatically claimed our marriage wasn't about love, but about securing my family's financial future. She was entirely correct, of course. Marriage is a business transaction. And because she ran away like a spoiled child, my family's estate lost millions in projected royal investments. It seems, Mr. Kincaid, that we share a common enemy. You want your treacherous brother and your deceptive ex-wife utterly humiliated, and I want access to the Windmir fortune that was promised to me." "What do you want from me?" Dalton asked. A sinister, desperate smile began to creep across his unshaven face. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of power. "I have lawyers," Julian stated smoothly. "The absolute best, most ruthless solicitors in London. Since Aurelia never officially finalized the American divorce papers, before flying back to inherit the crown, my legal team has discovered a microscopic, highly complex loophole regarding international marital assets and the timing of aristocratic successions." Julian paused, letting the bite dangle. "If we coordinate our stories to the international press, if we publicly claim that she and Connor had a scandalous torrid affair while she was still legally married to you living under your roof, we can utterly destroy her pristine reputation. The British Crown absolutely despises scandal. Her father, Percal Ravencroft, stepped down due to failing health and stress. If we apply enough media pressure, if we make the public outrage deafening enough, the royal trustees will panic. They will force her to settle with you quietly for tens of millions of pounds just to make the scandal disappear." Dalton looked around his miserable, freezing, empty apartment. He thought of the velvet tuxedo he used to wear. He thought of the corner office he used to occupy. "I'm in," Dalton said, his voice trembling with greed and malice. "Tell me exactly what to do." 2 weeks later, the storm broke with terrifying velocity. I was sitting in my private study reviewing the agricultural yields of the northern estates when Thomas walked in. His weathered face was grim, entirely devoid of his usual polite warmth. He carried a thick stack of glossy British tabloids and international newspapers. He placed them on the mahogany desk with a heavy, ominous thud. "My lady, we have a catastrophic public relations situation," Thomas said gravely, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. I picked up the top paper of the Daily Mail. The headline screamed in massive, bold, blood-red letters that seemed to jump off the page. "Duchess of Deceit, American ex-husband claims Windmir. Heir had torrid secret affair with his own brother, before fleeing back to royal riches." My stomach plummeted, a cold, nauseating dread pooling in my gut. I scanned the article. Dalton had sold an exclusive, highly fabricated interview for a massive sum of money. He painted himself as the devoted, hard-working, blue-collar husband who was brutally and callously abandoned when his secretive wife suddenly decided to run off with his treacherous brother to claim a royal fortune. He spun a narrative of betrayal, claiming he had caught us sneaking around the Lincoln Park house. Lord Julian Sterling had also provided exclusive quotes for the piece, claiming I had a long documented history of hysterical, unstable, and manipulative behavior toward the men who love her. Julian claimed I used men for entertainment before discarding them. Connor walked into the study moments later, reading the digital version of the news on his phone. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle ticked rapidly in his cheek. His storm grey eyes were dark with an anger I had rarely seen in him. "He's trying to ruin you." Connor said, his voice deadly quiet, laced with absolute protective fury. He couldn't handle being a high school English teacher's brother. He couldn't handle that you chose a loser over him. So now he's trying to drag us both into the deepest mud he can find. It is not just a tabloid smear campaign, so Thomas interjected, turning to Connor. Lord Julian's legal team has officially filed an injunction in the International Family Courts on Mr. Kincaid's behalf. They are aggressively contesting the timeline of the divorce decree. Because Her Grace assumed the ducal crown a mere 48 hours before the final decree, absolute was officially stamped and filed by the Chicago Municipal Courts. Dalton's lawyers are claiming he is entitled to a massive 50% percentage of the £3 billion estate as joint marital assets. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, taking a slow, deep breath. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. 5 years ago, I was 22 years old and suffocating under the immense, crushing weight of being Lady Aurelia Ravencroft. When Julian had betrayed me, then I had run. I had packed a single suitcase, boarded a commercial flight under a fake name, and fled to America to hide behind an espresso machine. I would have let them steal my peace just to avoid the confrontation, but I wasn't that fragile girl anymore. I had spent 3 long years biting my tongue while Dalton ignored me, belittled me, and made cruel, humiliating jokes at my expense in front of his friends. I had spent years apologizing for simply taking up space in my own home. That woman was dead. The fire in the hearth of the study caught the reflection of the emerald on my finger, reminding me exactly who I was, and exactly who was standing beside me. "He thinks I'm still the woman who stood shaking in a kitchen crying over a cup of coffee," I said. My voice did not tremble. It hardened into cold, absolute steel. I looked at Connor. He met my eyes, and I saw the exact same unwavering support, the exact same fierce loyalty he had shown me when he stood in my living room and told me he couldn't watch his brother destroy me anymore. "What do you want to do, Your Grace?" Connor asked, a dangerous, beautiful smile slowly forming on his lips. He knew I was not going to run. "We are hosting the Royal Benefactors Gala next weekend," I said, turning my attention back to Thomas. "It is the most highly publicized event of the season. I want you to send an official embossed royal invitation to Mr. Dalton Kincaid and Lord Julian Sterling. Grant them absolute VIP access. Alert the International Press Corps. Tell them the Duchess of Windmir is seeking an amicable public reconciliation to settle this unfortunate misunderstanding." Thomas's thick eyebrows rose in shock. "My lady, you want to invite the very men actively trying to extort you directly into the palace with the press watching?" "Dalton told me I was boring," I said, standing up from the desk. The movement was fluid, carrying the terrifying posture of a monarch preparing for war. "He told me I made him feel like he was drowning in oatmeal. It's time I showed my ex-husband exactly how entertaining I can be. Let them come. Let them think they've backed me into a corner. And then, Thomas, we will lock the doors." The Royal Benefactors Gala was the undisputed crown jewel of the British aristocratic social season. The grand cavernous hall of the Windmir estate was dripping in thousands of crystal chandeliers, gilded gold moulding, and priceless Renaissance art. Dukes, earls, foreign dignitaries, and global billionaires mingled, drinking vintage champagne that cost more per bottle than Dalton's former annual salary. The International Press Corps was penned behind velvet ropes near the grand entrance, their camera lenses flashing like a lightning storm. They were hungry for blood. They were waiting for the scandalous American ex-husband to arrive. Dalton arrived exactly at 8 o'clock. He stepped out of a rented town car wearing a rented tuxedo that didn't quite fit his shoulders. The sleeves were a fraction of an inch too long, the collar a bit too tight. He walked through the massive double doors with Lord Julian Sterling walking smoothly by his side. Julian looked entirely at home among the aristocracy, wearing a bespoke suit and sneering down his nose at the palace staff. Dalton, however, was sweating profusely. The sheer terrifying scale of my father's wealth, which was now entirely my wealth, was physically intimidating. The towering marble pillars, the guards in formal livery, the sea of diamonds, and inherited power. It was a world he could not comprehend, but his blinding greed, fueled by Julian's arrogant whispering, pushed him forward into the hall. They thought they had me completely cornered. They thought the threat of a prolonged, messy public scandal would force me to hand over tens of millions of pounds just to make them go away. They believed they were the predators. Connor and I stood at the very top of the grand, sweeping marble staircase. I wore a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk that moved like liquid water. Upon my head rested the ducal coronet heavily encrusted with sapphires and diamonds. Connor wore a flawless bespoke midnight tuxedo, looking every inch the powerful, commending royal consort my father knew he could be. "Showtime," Connor whispered, offering me his arm. His grip was warm and steady. We descended the stairs. The music from the string quartet abruptly faded. The deafening hum of conversation in the grand hall went completely terrifyingly dead silent as the guests parted for us, creating a wide, undeniable path. I walked directly toward Dalton and Julian. The press cameras flashed frantically in the background. "Aurelia," Dalton said, puffing out his chest desperately, trying to project the dominance and control he used to wield over me in our Lincoln Park bungalow. "Or should I say, Your Grace? It's time we talked about a financial settlement. You know you can't fight this in the press." "Lady Aurelia," Julian added, stepping forward with a slick, patronizing smile. "We are prepared to make this entire ugly tabloid mess disappear by tomorrow morning. For the right price, of course. Let us handle this quietly like civilized adults before your family's legacy is permanently ruined." I stopped exactly 3 feet away from them. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I let the absolute silence of the room stretch for 10 agonizing seconds, a psychological tactic I had learned from observing my father. "There will be no settlement," I said clearly. My voice was not loud, but it echoed perfectly in the cavernous hall. The dignitaries, the nobles, and the press were watching us like hawks. Dalton sneered, his face flushing red with sudden anger. "Then I'll take you to international court. I'll drag you and Connor through the absolute worst mud imaginable. I'll tell every newspaper in the world that you were cheating on me with my own brother. I'll tell them you're a freed." "You can certainly try Dalton," I said, my tone as smooth and cold as a frozen lake. "But you seem to have forgotten a very important detail about the Ravencroft family. We do not do anything halfway." Thomas stepped out from the shadows of the marble pillars. He was not carrying a tray of champagne. He was holding a sleek, encrypted digital tablet. "Lord Julian Sterling," Thomas said loudly, projecting his voice for the entire room and the press corps to hear. "2 days ago, the Royal Intelligence Network conducted a forensic audit of your family's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. We found a highly detailed series of wire transfers documenting massive payments made directly to tabloid editors and freelance journalists to print defamatory, entirely fabricated stories about the Duchess of Windmir." Julian's smug smile froze. "That is a direct, undeniable violation of the Crown's Defamation Act," Thomas continued flawlessly. "Furthermore, our audit uncovered that your family's estate is utterly, hopelessly bankrupt. You have been actively embezzling hundreds of thousands of pounds from the Royal Charity Trust for the past 3 years to fund your lavish lifestyle." Julian's face went the color of wet ash. That's an absolute lie. You have no proof. The financial authorities from Scotland Yard are waiting for you outside the estate gates as we speak, my lord." Thomas stated, utterly unmoved by Julian's panic. "You are facing 10 years in a maximum security prison for defrauding the Crown." Julian staggered backward, his breath catching in his throat. He looked around desperately for an ally, for someone to defend him. But the elite society members surrounding us, the people he had spent his entire life trying to impress, turned their backs on him in absolute unified disgust. He was socially and legally dead. I turned my attention to Dalton. His arrogant smirk had completely vanished. He looked exactly as he had the night he realized he had thrown away the wealthiest woman in Europe for a cheap mistress. The sweat on his forehead was now a cold sheen of terror. "As for you, Dalton," I said, quietly, stepping one fraction of an inch closer to him, "you claimed you were legally entitled to half of my assets because our divorce wasn't finalized before my coronation. You hired lawyers based on a technicality." I tilted my head, the diamonds of my coronet catching the chandelier light. "But you failed to read the fine print of the legal documents you so eagerly threw on the kitchen counter while I was washing dishes. The ironclad divorce papers you drafted, the ones you paid a cheap lawyer to write, explicitly stated that you unilaterally waived all rights to any hidden future or undiscovered assets. You demanded that clause because you arrogantly believed I had nothing, and you wanted to ensure I couldn't touch your miserable marketing salary in the future." Dalton swallowed hard. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. "The Chicago Municipal Courts finalized that exact paperwork the very morning you filed it." I finished my voice a lethal whisper. "You have absolutely zero legal claim to my estate." "You never did." Dalton's knees physically buckled. He swayed on his feet, his hands trembling violently. "Aurelia, baby, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. It was the exact same pathetic phrase, the exact same tone he had used when he was crawling on the floor toward me months ago in Chicago. "You have to understand the stress I was under. I was desperate. Please don't do this." "I understand perfectly," Connor intervened. Connor stepped seamlessly between me and his brother. Connor's voice was low, lethal, and absolute. There was no trace of the quiet English teacher left. He was a guardian, a protector, a king in all but name. "You threw her away like garbage, Dalton." Connor said, his storm grey eyes locked onto his brother's terrified face. "You called her boring. You brought your mistress into her home. You tried to extort her. You had your chance to be a decent man. Instead, you actively chose to be a monster." "I'll go to the press," Dalton shrieked, sheer hysteria creeping into the edges of his voice, losing all control of his volume. "I'll tell them my side. I'll tell them how you both manipulated me. You have no truth," I said, simply stepping out from behind Connor to deliver the final blow. "And you no longer have an audience. The tabloids have already received the massive dossier of Julian's bribery and your fabricated quotes. Your credibility is entirely permanently destroyed globally. You are a broke, unemployed, desperate man who tried to extort a sovereign duchess." I looked at Thomas, giving a single sharp nod. "Escort Mr. Kincaid off the premises," I commanded. "He is permanently banned from entering the United Kingdom." "No, Aurelia, wait. I love you. I've always loved you." Dalton screamed, echoing the exact pathetic cries he had made on the front lawn of the Lincoln Park house. Two massive royal guards in full livery seized Dalton firmly by the arms. He thrashed and kicked a pathetic, undignified display, but it was entirely useless against their strength. He was dragged out of the glittering silent hall, screaming my name, completely and utterly humiliated in front of the most powerful people in Europe, while the press cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every second of his ruin. I watched the heavy, ancient oak doors close firmly behind him. The thud echoed through the hall, signaling the absolute end. The silence in the room was profound. It was the sound of a bloodline asserting its power. I turned back to my 300 guests. I did not apologize for the scene. I reached out and took a crystal glass of champagne from a passing silver tray. To the future, I said, my voice steady, commanding, and absolute. The 300 guests raised their glasses in immediate unified precision. "To the Duchess!" They echoed the sound, rolling like thunder through the estate. Later that night, long after the last dignitary had departed, and the press had scattered to write their explosive headlines, Connor and I walked through the quiet, moonlit gardens of the estate. The air was deeply peaceful, filled with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated clarity. The ghosts of Chicago were finally dead. Connor stopped walking near a marble fountain. He turned to me and pulled me gently into his chest, burying his face in my hair. He let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. "You were absolutely terrifying in there," Connor said, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his handsome face as he pulled back to look at me. "I've never been more in love with you. I told you I was going to correct my mistake in the most spectacular way possible. I laughed softly, feeling lighter than I had in 5 years. You did, he said, his expression turning serious, tender, and deeply emotional. He reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear. For 3 years, I watched you shrink yourself smaller and smaller. I watched you apologize for simply breathing. Seeing you tonight, seeing you stand in your absolute power, dismantling them with nothing but your intellect and the truth, it was the greatest privilege of my life. I looked down at the heavy emerald ring on my finger. Then I looked up into the storm-grey eyes of the man who had loved me for exactly who I was. He didn't care about the £3 billion estate. He didn't care about the titles, the castles, or the royal prestige. He cared about the woman who made terrible jokes about burnt turkey at Christmas. He cared about the woman who cried over burnt toast. He saw me when I was invisible, and he supported me when I was invincible. My father was right, I said quietly, stepping closer to him, closing the distance between us. A duchess absolutely needs a consort, someone of incredibly strong character who understands the true meaning of loyalty. I wrapped my arms around his neck, standing on my tiptoes. When we get married, I whispered against his lips, I don't want a massive spectacle. I don't want the tabloids, the press, or the foreign dignitaries. I just want you. I just want my family. Whatever you want, Aurelia, Connor promised, his voice thick with emotion, leaning down to capture my lips in a slow, deep kiss. I'm not going anywhere. Not ever. Karma is an absolute force. It is the inescapable, unforgiving ledger of the universe. Dalton chose cruelty, arrogance, and a mistress believing he held all the power because he owned a house and had a corporate job. In the end, he lost his career, his dignity, his home, and his reputation left to rot in the very irrelevance he had so desperately tried to force upon me. But I chose a good man over a cruel one. That is all this has ever been about. I found my strength, my crown, in a love that never once asked me to be less than I was. As I stood in the English moonlight, wrapped in the arms of the man I loved, listening to the gentle splash of the fountain, I knew the frightened, timid barista from Boston was truly gone. The Duchess of Windmir had finally come home, and she was never going to shrink herself for anyone ever again. The morning after the Royal Benefactors Gala, the British press did not just print the news, they detonated it. The headlines had fundamentally shifted overnight. I sat in the sunlit breakfast room of the Windmir estate, sipping black tea from a bone china cup, watching Connor effortlessly flip through the morning papers. He looked remarkably well-rested for a man who had just helped orchestrate the social execution of 2 grown men. The Daily Mail, which had so eagerly printed Dalton's lies just 48 hours prior, now featured a massive full-page photograph of Dalton Kincaid being physically dragged out of my estate by the Royal Guard. The headline read, "The begging ex-husband American conman banned from UK after botched royal extortion plot." Beside it, the Times ran a much more serious and devastating headline. Ashbourne, disgraced Lord Julian Sterling, arrested by Scotland Yard for Crown defamation and Royal Trust embezzlement. It's a bloodbath out there. Connor noted his tone mild, almost conversational, as he folded the newspaper and set it aside. Julian's father, the Viscount, has officially released a public statement disowning him. They are liquidating their remaining country estates just to pay off the embezzlement debt they owe to your charity trust. Julian was denied bail. I took a slow sip of my tea. And Dalton, Connor said, a dark amusement dancing in his storm-grey eyes, is currently trapped in a cheap motel near Heathrow Airport. His return flight to Chicago isn't until tomorrow, and his credit cards have reportedly been declined at the hotel bar. Thomas had one of our security liaisons keep a discreet eye on him, just to ensure he actually leaves the country. The sheer staggering magnitude of their downfall was almost difficult to process. Months ago, I was a woman terrified of making the wrong type of coffee, conditioned to believe that my voice had absolutely no value. I had allowed Dalton to dictate the terms of me reality. He had weaponized my desire for a normal, quiet life against me. Do you feel sorry for him? Connor asked quietly, watching my face. I looked out the massive bay windows at the sprawling, perfectly manicured gardens. No, I answered honestly. Pity requires a belief that the person is a victim of circumstance. Dalton is not a victim. He is the author of his own ruin. Every single wound he currently possesses is entirely self-inflicted. Connor reached across the table, his warm fingers covering my hand, resting gently over the heavy emerald ring. Thomas also forwarded me the final legal brief from Chicago. Connor added his voice, dropping into a professional cadence. Since the Lincoln Park house has been officially reclaimed by your trust, the property managers did a walkthrough. Dalton left it in a complete state of disarray when he was evicted. Belle apparently took anything of value: the television, the expensive espresso machine, even the silk curtains when she realized he was broke. A small, genuine laugh escaped my lips. The absolute irony of the situation was a masterpiece. Dalton had thrown me away for a woman he claimed made him feel alive. In the end, she stripped him down to the studs the absolute second his bank account hit zero. Have the property managers sell the house. I commanded smoothly, the authoritative tone of the Duchess coming to me more naturally every day. I don't want to see it again. Take the proceeds from the sale and establish an anonymous scholarship fund for underprivileged high school students in Chicago who want to study English literature. A tribute to your teaching days. Connor's eyes widened slightly in surprise, followed by a profound melting warmth. Aurelia, that is incredibly generous. It is not generosity, Connor. It is reclamation, I said, squeezing his hand. I am taking a house that represented the darkest, most suffocating years of my life, and I am turning it into something that creates light. I refuse to let Dalton Kincaid's memory leave a stain on the world. The transition from a quiet American barista to a reigning European duchess was not a fairy tale montage of trying on tiaras and riding in carriages. It was grueling, relentless administrative warfare. The Duchy of Windmir was not just an ancient title, it was a sprawling, multifaceted global corporation. We owned commercial real estate in London, massive agricultural tracts in Scotland, and highly lucrative shipping ports along the coast. My father had managed it with an iron fist for 5 decades, but his failing health had allowed certain investments to stagnate. I spent the next 3 months locked in the royal war room. The massive oak table was constantly buried under blueprints, financial ledgers, and trade agreements. I was not alone in the trenches. Connor proved to be an invaluable asset. The meticulous analytical mind required to teach classic literature translated flawlessly into parsing complex legal jargon and international trade contracts. Where I was the hammer commanding the room, and setting the grand vision, Connor was the scalpel, finding the hidden liabilities and quietly managing the diplomatic relationships with the estate managers. We were a terrifyingly efficient partnership. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November when Thomas knocked on the heavy oak doors of the war room. Enter, and I called out, not looking up from a complex agricultural subsidy report. Thomas stepped into the room holding a single crisp white envelope. My lady, forgive the interruption. A letter arrived through the standard post. It was heavily screened by the security team, but they deemed it safe for your eyes. It is from Chicago. I frowned, lowering my gold pen. Connor, who was sitting across the table reviewing a port expansion blueprint, looked up, his posture instantly stiffening. From Chicago, Connor asked. Is it from him? No, sir, Thomas replied, stepping forward and placing the envelope on the desk. It is from Belle. The name sent a bizarre jolt through the room. Belle, the mistress. The woman Dalton had so proudly moved into my home before the sheets were even cold. I picked up the envelope. It was cheap, thin paper. I broke the seal and pulled out a single handwritten page. The handwriting was erratic, shaky. Lady Aurelia, I don't know if you will ever read this, or if your guards will just throw it away. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know what I did was wrong. I let Dalton convince me that you were a lazy, manipulative gold digger who was holding him back from his potential. He told me you were bleeding him dry. I am writing this because I need you to know the truth about what happened after you left. Dalton went completely insane. He didn't just lose his job, he lost his mind. He spent every hour of every day obsessing over your social media, reading articles about you screaming at the television when your face appeared on the news. He blamed me. He said if I hadn't pushed him to file the divorce papers so quickly, he would have had time to secure his share of your fortune. He became volatile, cruel. He called me names I won't repeat here. He expected me to pay the rent for the miserable apartment we had to move into after your lawyer kicked us out of the house. When I told him I was leaving, he tried to physically block the door. I am gone now. I moved back to Ohio to live with my parents. But I wanted you to know that you didn't just escape a bad marriage. You escaped a monster. He is a hollow, empty shell of a man who has nothing left but his own venom. I am sorry for my part in your pain. Belle. I read the letter in absolute silence. The only sound in the war room was the heavy rain lashing against the thick, bulletproof glass of the arched windows. I handed the letter across the table to Connor. He read it quickly, his storm grey eyes darkening with every line. When he finished, he set the paper down and let out a long, heavy breath. He blamed her, Connor said, shaking his head in disgust. Classic Dalton. It is never his fault. The universe is always conspiring against his alleged greatness. He will spend the rest of his miserable life looking in the rearview mirror, I said quietly, feeling a strange hollow sense of finality. He will sit in dive bars and tell anyone who will listen that he used to be married to a billionaire duchess and that he was robbed. He will be a ghost haunting his own life. I picked up the letter. I did not keep it. I walked over to the massive stone fireplace burning at the edge of the room. I dropped the cheap paper into the roaring flames. We watched the edges curl, turn black, and disintegrate into floating ash. That is the absolute definitive end of it, I said, turning my back on the fire and walking back to the table. No more ghosts. No more Chicago. We have an empire to run. Connor smiled a sharp, fiercely proud expression. He picked up his pen. Then let's get back to work, Your Grace.